Gagandeep Kang, thank you very much for talking to Moneycontrol. Dr. Kang, of course, needs no introduction. She's one of India's most eminent virologists, scientists, and is an advisor to multiple state governments on their vaccination strategy, the way they should be handling this going forward. Thank you very much for talking to us. You mentioned a few weeks ago that, mid-May to end May is when you expect the second wave of coronavirus, which has been really harsh for India, to somewhat start tapering. Based on what you're seeing now, the data from various states, how it seems to be peaking out in some metros, while at the same time it's spreading in rural India. What do you think about the situation now, Dr. Kang, compared to, say, 2 weeks ago?
So let's be clear that these are not my recommendations. These are recommendations of real experts in modeling who predicted mid-May to the end of May as being the time when we would begin to see tapering. And I think what we are seeing is possibly that they are right. It's always a question of how long the pattern is sustained. And right now we are at the early stages of a flat or declining pattern, which is somewhat complicated by the fact that the testing has also been quite variable. So it isn't just the absolute numbers we should be looking at, but the numbers as a proportion of all the tests that have been done, and an understanding that has testing completeness varied over time. And some of the reports that we are hearing in the press is that there is less testing going on in places that have a lot of disease, where you would expect that as you increase disease in a particular place, you should be increasing testing. And my understanding is that in many places, that's not happening.
Right. And, you've also been tasked by the Karnataka government recently to help with their vaccination strategy protocol going forward. What will your focus area be? Because currently Karnataka, Bengaluru, this has sort of become the epicenter of the pandemic. Of course, the issue is, where are the vaccines? Multiple states have floated global tenders. The government has given a procurement schedule that, between August to December, India will have over 2 billion doses. But how do you see this panning out going forward?
So my basic principle is, to take projections with a grain of salt. Because if you remember last year, we were told that Serum Institute was going to be producing 100 million doses of vaccine a month by December, that Bharat Biotech was going to be producing in the tens of millions of doses by December. There was going to be a large stockpile that was available with them. As we found that has not been the case. And now the 100 million a month has been pushed to the latter half of this year. We know that production capacity right now is probably not going to be more than somewhere between 2.5, 3 million for both companies. I may be wrong by some factor, but I don't think very wrong in that estimate. And we need much, much more than that. So when we project to say that there is going to be 2 billion doses of vaccine in the last 5 months of this year, I'm a bit skeptical, because we haven't seen the previous predictions play out well. And when I look at that list, I see vaccines for which we have no data. So, for example, the nasal vaccine, how's that going to work? We know that in general, nasal vaccines don't work very well against many respiratory infections. The examples we have are of measles and flu vaccines. And while it sounds like a brilliant solution, and I really hope it works, I would like to wait until I see the data. Similarly, a DNA vaccine, we've never had a licensed DNA vaccine for humans. Once again, it is a new technology developed. The vaccine development has taken place entirely in India. I'd be very supportive of this vaccine, but I'd like to see the phase 3 data for that before thinking that this is a valuable addition to the vaccines that we are likely to have. So I think the projections are a bit optimistic. I hope very much that I am completely wrong and the government is completely right. But we'll have to just wait and see.
Dr. Kang, this skepticism that was there, I mean, that's there around, say, the nasal or the DNA vaccine. There were similar doubts raised in January as well when, Covaxin got approval, that why was this given in clinical trial mode without publication of efficacy data? But, just a few months down the line, everybody is ready for any vaccine in the market. Covaxin later published data which said that it is effective. So do you think that, this is a risk that perhaps the government is taking based on track record, based on, their proven history? Because I remember Covaxin, you said in January that, I'm not going to take this till there's efficacy data published. And a few months down the line, you said that Covishield, Covaxin, both of them work well. So, I mean, should we be hopeful that something similar could happen here as well?
I think there's a difference between faith and science. Okay? We know that when you do phase 1 and phase 2 studies, you're looking at safety and immunogenicity. And immunogenicity can be a good prediction of whether vaccines will work or not. But it's not a perfect predictor, and it doesn't tell you how well vaccines are going to work. And if you want to be able to look at vaccines and really say that they work, either you need an immunogenicity marker, which is a correlate of protection, or you need clinical efficacy data. At the point at which Covaxin was approved for restricted use in clinical trial mode, there was no correlate of protection and there was no clinical efficacy data. So what I said at that time, and I stand by it, is that I don't think we should be licensing vaccines for which we have no indication of whether they work or not. And we did not have that information for Covaxin at that time. Once the clinical efficacy data became available, even as an interim analysis, then I'm willing to accept a vaccine. The government placed a bet, and it was a correct bet to place in that view. But I think if you want credibility in your regulatory process, then if you lay out a pathway for a vaccine, then stick to that pathway. Why are there regulators? The regulators are there to ensure that there is data that informs the quality of a vaccine, the safety of the vaccine, and the efficacy of the vaccine, right? Now, when you have data that informs all three of those, you're fine to give that to the population. But you can't say, we believe that because there is immunogenicity data, we believe that this vaccine will be efficacious. Okay? Now, all of the vaccines that had been licensed up to that point, even emergency use authorization, other than the Russian and the Chinese vaccines, had clinical efficacy data. The Russian and the Chinese vaccines have subsequently put out clinical efficacy data in the public domain. The Russians through a publication, and there are some questions around that now. And in China through press releases. We still don't have a publication for Bharat Biotech, but I think Bharat Biotech is a good company that makes really good products. So if they say their interim analysis is showing them round about 80% efficacy, I'm perfectly willing to accept that. but I would not accept the data from an inactivated vaccine, the Bharat product, with an unknown adjuvant, where you had only immunogenicity data and an animal efficacy study without any human data whatsoever. And I'll stand by that. Now, if we change the entire regulatory process to say immunogenicity is sufficient, any vaccine that shows us immunogenicity data is fine to be used in a population in clinical trial mode, fine. That's up to regulators to make that decision. But the fact remains that at that time, we were still operating with a regulatory pathway that said that until we have clinical efficacy data and at least 2 months of safety information for at least 50% of the people in the clinical trial having received 2 doses of vaccine, then we will approve the vaccine, right? At that time, we had no efficacy data and no safety data.
Right. Dr. Kang, on paper, the vaccination procurement schedule looks promising, but as you said, and like many people are saying, we haven't seen that proof of these companies being able to ramp up capacity. And even if you look at it, there seems to be a huge dependence on Serum and Bharat Biotech. I think out of the 2.1 billion doses, at least 1.3 would come from Covishield, Covaxin, and then you have 5 other manufacturers. Now, what is the alternative here? I mean, we spoke to Dr. Devi Shetty earlier this week. He said that, India should just buy as one, buy in bulk, whatever vaccines have been approved globally. Do you think we need to think that way instead of waiting for this to play out between August to December? And, many of these vaccines that they're talking about, they haven't been approved. They're still in the trial phase. Or will it be too late by then? Just want to know what we need to do today.
The central procurement for anything that is in the national immunization program is something that the government has done forever. It's always been that anything being bought, any vaccines being bought for the national program are bought by the center and distributed to the states, and then the states run their immunization programs. And there's variability across the states, but the vaccines are bought and supplied to the states. Now, this can happen and has happened before in a phased manner, but there's never been any question that the entire cohort that needs to be vaccinated is provided vaccines through central procurement. This changed in April. Last year, in August, the government had said, we will go for central procurement, had told the states there is no reason for you to go for your own procurement measures. It changes overnight in April. Now, states which could have done this months ago are at the back of the queue where any manufacturer is concerned, because so far they haven't talked to domestic manufacturers, they haven't talked to international manufacturers. They are literally going to be told overnight that in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you're now responsible for 2/3 of your population. How are they expected to deal with this? I completely agree with Dr. Devi Shetty that there needs to be central procurement, but there was never a need to set up for states to procure again. You're creating a market where it's a free for all. You've got the private sector that can pay higher prices. You've got states that have a fixed price. And states are going to compete with each other, and which manufacturer is going to supply to which state. Now, if you have a manufacturer that's located in Maharashtra or in Telangana, are they going to be providing vaccines to, let's say, Himachal Pradesh or Uttarakhand before they provide to Maharashtra and Telangana? I think that's kind of unlikely, because there are many drivers of how states will decide on who they choose to provide when. Is it in order? Your email or your letter came in before the other letter. it's complicated. And it's unnecessary to have this level of complication. It's an opportunity cost for everybody involved in this. Central procurement would have been the simpler solution. After all, ultimately, if vaccines are free for everybody, which has been the way it has been in the vaccination program, it is good for all of us.
Dr. Kang, the other thing that people are talking about is the third wave and how it's going to particularly impact children. Now, there is no vaccine in the market currently that's approved for children. I mean, Pfizer is working on one, Bharat Biotech is working on one. How should we really prepare for the third wave? Will enough young parents be vaccinated by then? Because currently our daily vaccination numbers are below the 2 million mark. It should, ideally be tracking the 10 million mark. So how can we really prepare for the third wave? Or do you believe there will be enough herd protection by then, because a significant percent of the population, would have been impacted through the second?
So I don't understand why we think in terms of second wave. Will there be a third wave? Why not? Why will there be a fourth wave or a 16th wave? I think the way we are beginning to understand this virus is that, the biggest thing that I don't understand is why did the first wave die down in the manner in which it did. That leads me to think that there must be, obviously, in terms of spread, there are significant behavioral drivers, because we have an understanding that our behavior led to the size of the second wave. We also know that variants play a role, but I think there are also environmental drivers. And as more and more people are exposed to the virus or are vaccinated, I think we will see the environmental drivers and the viral determinants, the variation in the virus, that will determine what future waves look like. And if we don't get a reasonable handle on control through vaccination, or sadly through too much of the population being infected, I think we are going to wind up with this virus potentially being seasonal, and with us seeing one or more waves a year. With influenza, for example, India has 2 waves every year. And we don't talk about influenza and the waves. Will SARS-CoV-2 settle down and be rather like influenza? It's very possible, but we need to understand a lot more. We are understanding more about temperature, humidity, and how they drive survival of this virus in the environment. And I think we will begin to understand more about the drivers of seasonality as we complete 2 years with this virus.
The other change that the government made this week was the interval in Covishield. We increased it to 12 to 16 weeks. And the UK government, in fact, brought it down because of the Indian variant. So again, do you think this is rooted in science? Is this more of a supply issue? Because again, this is a concern that people have. Is the government doing this only because we do not have enough vaccines in the market now?
So based on the science, I've been recommending, I think since February, that we should be increasing the dose for Covishield to 12 weeks. Now that is based on real world data that has come from the UK, looking at the B117 variant, which was the predominant variant circulating in that country. And the real world data showed that if you give 1 dose of either the Pfizer or the AstraZeneca vaccine, up to 12 weeks, you had really pretty good protection against severe disease and death. So first the data came out from Scotland, and then the data came out from the UK, showing that there's really good protection against B117. Now, I know that everyone's really worried about B1617, including in the UK, where they're doing a lot more sequencing than we are doing in India today. But in India, it's not clear to me, even though INSACOG is producing a lot of data now, it's not clear to me where B1617 is the predominant strain across the country and when it became predominant, right?
Yeah.
We still have a lot of B117, in which case the recommendation of B117 and 12 weeks still holds. And for B1617, if we argue that our laboratory data is showing us that you will get as much protection against B1617 as you do with B117, then I don't see the need to switch to a shorter duration. Also in the UK, important to remember that the recommendation is 50 and above, right? So I think we need to look at the data. We need to gather real world evidence in India before we chop and change. I'm not uncomfortable with a 12-week interval with the Covishield vaccine, something I've been saying since February, still saying in May. But I'd really like for us to have real-time data that drives our decisions about, what are the variants that are circulating in various parts of the country? How well are the vaccines working against, each of the vaccines? How well are they working? I mean, look at it. Right now, we've got how much? 170, 180 million doses of vaccine that have been given out since January. We should have data on how well the vaccines are working, and we should have data on how well the vaccines are working against different variants if we are to make science-based decisions.
Right. Dr. Kang, the other issue that is cropping up is the lack of consistency we are seeing in treatment protocols. For example, now there is this debate on plasma therapy. There is this
There's no
constant
debate on plasma therapy.
There was news yesterday that, it may not be recommended by the government going forward.
It should not be recommended.
Yeah. Okay, it should not be recommended. But the request for plasma is still huge across the country. A lot of people. Yes, Dr. Kang.
We've had one study. We have systematic reviews that show that plasma therapy does not work. We have large-scale trials and one reasonably sized trial in India that shows that it does not work in patients who have severe disease and have been hospitalized. The only study that shows that plasma works is in a study with very high titer neutralizing antibodies given to people very, very early in illness and to elderly people. It worked there. That's a very small group. By the time your patients are in hospital, there is no evidence that plasma will work. Remember that when you have an infection, the early phase is viral replication. That's where antibodies work. By the time you get to severe disease, it's really about suppression of the immune response that becomes important. At that stage, plasma is not going to help. There's no debate.
But, see, despite this, we see a lot of requests for plasma from patients, from hospital. I mean, I'm sure, these requests are coming from them because the hospitals are asking for it. Remdesivir, similarly.
I'm sorry, but irrational treatment in India is a fact. It is not new to COVID. We have had a lot of irrational treatment that comes from people who don't follow the evidence. We have a lot of private hospitals that recommend inappropriate therapies. The fact that a lot of people recommend it does not make it right.
Coming to the final part of the interview, Dr. Kang, based on where we are today, looking at the pace of vaccination, by when do you believe there will be some light at the end of the tunnel for India, based on where we are?
I really think we need to ramp up vaccination, but there isn't supply. So everything that we can do to enhance supply should be done. And I think that we will have our Indian suppliers ramping up in the latter half of this year. So more doses will become available from Serum, from Bharat Biotech. I hope that Biologically gets good results from their trials. Zydus Cadila gets good results from their trial, because that will mean that we will have more doses of vaccine available. And those most likely will all be for people in India. Now, we also should have more doses available from the global market, because once the developed economies, which is essentially Europe and North America, which are relatively small populations, once they've finished vaccinating their populations, their vaccine manufacturers are already making lots of doses. So while a lot of the doses have been committed to the COVAX facility, there may be doses available for us if we start booking them now. So I think we should be doing everything we can to ensure that we get as much vaccine as possible. Unfortunately, given the size of our population and the pace at which we are going, I'm not seeing 70% of our population vaccinated by December at this pace. We really need to ramp up vaccine supply. We really need to ramp up the pace of vaccination and make sure that we try to get to 70-80% of our population being vaccinated, which means reaching practically all adults. Because ultimately, when it comes to children and immunizing children, I really think right now is not the time to be immunizing kids. I think we should be thinking about globally immunizing the elderly and then an age descending strategy so that adults all over the world are immunized before we get to children.
Thank you very much for everything that you do, and it's always amazing listening to your insights. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.